In this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about how to think about risk. There are many different ways to organize your thinking about risk, but I've found that there are four essential elements that help me to think about risk, and I'd like to pass them along to you. They're listed here. The first thing is there has to be some sort of trigger. Something has to trigger or initiate this reason or opportunity to be even thinking about risks. So this trigger is usually a hazard or an opportunity in your environment that you become aware of. Second is there has to be uncertainty. If we're going to be dealing with risk, there are simply going to be things that you don't know, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with those things. The third element to help you wrap your head around this idea of risk is to identify the harm that can occur when a person is exposed to that hazard or that opportunity. So this has to be some sort of undesirable consequence. And the fourth element is the sequence of events that's necessary to lead to that harm. So we're going to talk about each of these individually for a moment or two. And let's begin with the idea of a hazard. Hazards come in many forms. They can be natural disasters like floods. They can be fires, microbes in our food. They could be accidents that occur at work, in our travel, in our personal life. It can be adverse health effects, financial setbacks, bad choices, accidents in transportation, stupid things that we do, the way we eat, natural disasters once again, transportation. Hazards are everywhere. So your first task, since most of the risks you're going to be dealing with will be risks of loss, your very first task is to identify the hazard. And in a very general sense, a hazard is anything that is a potential source of harm. A rock in a harbor, a microbe on a chicken carcass, containers that are stacked too high, tsunamis. Not all risks are risks of loss. We've talked about opportunities for gain that can come from gambling or profitable business enterprises. No one would talk about the risk of getting married or the risk of getting a raise or a new job, but still there are risks that are present there. On the lower left there, we have some ecosystem restoration. If we make these changes to the ecosystem, will we see the desired effects? On the lower right, a navigation channel is being dredged in hopes of bringing new commerce and larger ships into a harbor. The upper left shows a new transportation system. We invest in a lot of things that we hope will present gains to society. Other examples include the wind turbine field that you see here. The opportunities for society are endless. So once again, if you're working with a risk, the initial step is to identify the hazard or the opportunity in your situation. The next thing that's useful to do is to think about the uncertainty. What is it about this hazard? What is it about this opportunity, its probability and its consequence that we're not so sure about, or that could turn out in different ways? So here's a little schematic that might help you to think about this a little bit more systematically. We've talked about the elements of risk in our conceptual equation, probability times a consequence. So this shows both of those elements right here. And I remind you that's not a literal equation for calculating risk. It's simply a conceptual model that helps us to remember these two key elements. And what this graphic is showing is that the probability is subject to uncertainty. There could be facts that we don't have about this probability. There could be natural variability in the process. So for example, if we're talking about floods, there could be uncertainty about this. When will the next flood occur? How long will it last? How much time will there be between floods? All of these things are uncertain for a variety of reasons. There's also uncertainty about the consequence of a risk associated with any sort of hazard. So once again, if we're talking about flooding, we might not know what the total damage would be. The total damage might vary depending on the time of year, and so the consequences would also be subject to sources of uncertainty. We've earlier identified two primary sources of uncertainty, one being knowledge uncertainty, which is the situation when there are facts in the world that we just do not possess, and the other is natural variability, which takes into account the fact that we live in a complex world with complex physical and human systems that have a lot of natural variability built into them. So uncertainty is the second element that you need to be able to think about. What are the key uncertainties? What are the major data gaps? What are the big missing pieces in your knowledge base when you're trying to think about these hazards and these opportunities? The next thing that's important to think about is the harm that can be caused by the hazard, or the harm that will occur if opportunities are not realized. Oftentimes, risk assessors simply analyze effects and they don't specify whether these effects are harmful or not. When you hear things like sea level rise, climate change, aquatic nuisance species, they all sound like there is a harmful effect, but unless you say what it is, it's not going to be easy to do any kind of valuable, useful, or fruitful risk analysis. So let's go with the idea of aquatic nuisance species. If the Asian carp move from the Mississippi River into the Great Lakes in the United States, there are some people who would say that alone is a bad thing. But the way we're talking about this harm now is it's not enough to say that effect of moving from one basin to the other is harm. You would have to specify in a very specific way what the harm would be. So if you're going to characterize risk, harm has to be defined as specifically as possible. Those harms come in the two flavors we've talked about frequently now. One would be the potential for a loss of a valued asset, and the other would be that there would be some sort of gain that would not be realized. So this would be the third element, to make a very clear, careful definition of what the specific harm would be. And if there is more than one kind of harm, then each kind of harm should be identified. Once we've identified the harm, then it's important to specify the sequence of events that's necessary for this harm to occur. So once you've established what the harm is, we need a conceptual model, or a scenario, or a pathway, or a sequence of events. These are all different terms that basically mean the same thing, and that is, tell me how this harm happens. If we're talking about an uncertain gain, then we are talking about identifying a sequence of events that's necessary for that opportunity not to be realized. Of the terms that are used for the sequence of events, one that you may have heard before or that you may hear in the literature is a conceptual model. There are a lot of descriptions of the risk assessment process that say you should begin with a conceptual model. That conceptual model is essentially the sequence of events that's necessary to lead to harm if each step in the sequence is realized.